Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches, where today I'm going to be talking about the sixth installment of the Friday the 13th franchise, Jason Lives. Back in the ever less accurately named Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, 12-year-old Tommy Jarvis finally slew the mass murderer Jason Voorhees, quote, for good, unquote. But despite the seeming finality of that event, Tommy has never been able to shake the conviction that Jason would be back. Which is why the now 20-year-old Tommy decides to break into the cemetery where Jason is buried, exhume the body, and send it up in flames. Given his pyrotechnic plans, Tommy probably should have chosen a less storm-racked night on which to visit Jason's grave. The middle of a heavy deluge hardly seems the most optimal time to start a bonfire. The rain will, however, soon be the least of Tommy's problems, because after an errant bolt of lightning slams into Jason's maggot-inspected corpse, the implacable killer rises from his very grave. With his nigh supernatural resistance injury now escalated to actual supernatural levels, Jason narrowly misses out on killing Tommy in this first encounter, but is soon merrily hacking his way through anyone else he happens across. Meanwhile, Tommy desperately tries to persuade the authorities that they've got a resurrected killer on their hands, which goes about as well as you might expect, though the local sheriff's attractive daughter seems rather more willing to believe him than does her father. Can Tommy find some way to stop the killing machine he has unwittingly released? And more importantly, will watching him try be a fun way to spend your time? So Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, did pretty well financially, but long-time franchise fans didn't like that the movie actually did try to do something new with the Friday the 13th franchise. Of course, it also didn't help that the film was lazily written schlock with a thematically inconsistent conclusion, but let's put that aside. That left Paramount with two real options for a sequel: stay the course while actually trying to make the next movie good, or just bring back Jason Voorhees in any old slop and hope that the iconic killer would be enough to get fans back on board. Unsurprisingly, they chose the latter option. They might like that Friday the 13th money, but they weren't going to exert any real effort to get it. And this film did indeed turn a tidy profit, though it continued the slow decline of ticket sales from the previous movie. Jason Lives also enjoyed better than average critical reception for a slasher movie, so it was only mixed to negative rather than overwhelmingly negative. Gene Siskel, for instance, rated it the best film in the franchise thus far, but still only gave it 1.5 stars. Now, personally, I think 1.5 stars is pretty generous. Let's talk about why. So the first problem with this movie, as a slasher movie, is that for some reason, probably the mid-1980s moralist pushback on gory, sexualized films, Friday the 13th Part 6 appears to be an attempt to answer the question, what would a Friday the 13th movie look like if it had no nudity or gore? And the problem with this is twofold. First, it was not a question that any fan of the franchise was asking or wanted answered. These were the common elements of slasher films precisely because the primary audience, men in their late teens and early 20s, wanted to see them. Now, of course, you can't grow a franchise by only pandering to its existing fan base, but that brings me to the second half of the problem. Nobody who wasn't a fan was going to have their minds changed by the sixth entry that's gone, exactly the same story as parts 2 through 4, only without as much skin or blood on show. You can't grow the franchise at this point unless you really do something different, and you're not going to do something different except be boring. In this regard, Howard Whitlis' script, Part 5 was a superior movie. It did at least try to find a way to evolve the series. It utterly failed to do so in an engaging or entertaining way, but it tried. Jason Lives feels like a step backward in that regard, a knee-jerk reversion to the familiar tropes, just with less sex, less gore, and more attempts at jokes. Apparently, some contemporary critics really liked the fact that Part 6 poked fun at itself and at the wider Friday franchise, possibly because those critics looked down on the whole series as crass and tawdry and felt smugly superior that the movies themselves were now agreeing with them. The filmmakers' attempts to recompense the lack of prurient content with ham-handed attempts at comedy is not likely, however, to win anyone over who actually wants to watch a slasher movie. Oh, some guy slammed his face into the tree and it made a bloody smiley face. Oh, the kids at summer camp are making droll comments about their chances of survivals. The laughs, they barely start. A real effort to inject some tension and menace would have been a much more effective way to make this movie work, and could have been done while still reducing the blood and nudity. But it would also probably be much harder to pull off. And as I said before, making an effort doesn't seem to be something this creative team were much interested in doing. This lack of care is something that the film shows from its very first scene. On the one hand, it's actually one of the more effective sequences with some neat practical effects, but on the other, the resurrection of Jason Voorhees is constructed on a flagrant disregard for the events of the previous movie. First, because it jettisons that film's ending, though it was a terrible ending, so maybe that's not all bad. But second, because Part 5 clearly told us that Jason Voorhees was cremated, so there's no body to dig up. To add insult to injury, the climax of Jason Lives is based on a concept that would have still allowed the film to bring back Jason Voorhees, even if he had been cremated. A concept that, had they followed through on it, would even solve the franchise's longest-running continuity issue, the question of how Jason Voorhees can be a slasher killer when the whole motivation for the murders in the first Friday was that he drowned as a young boy. So in other words, these guys came up with the perfect tool to not only justify their own movie, but also to fix a long-term flaw in the whole franchise, and then they blew right past it without a moment's thought, creating an even bigger tangle. And you might be saying, do the people who watch these movies really care about such things? And I guess the answer is that some of us do, and apparently much more so than the people who made them. This one, it's for Friday completists only. Next time, in 1989, John Woo wrote and directed The Killer, a film that enjoyed massive international critical acclaim. And then, in 2024, 35 years after the original movie, he remade it for Western audiences. So, I'm going to talk about both versions. But that is next time. Until then, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've seen Friday the 13th Part 6, let me know what you thought of it.